I had a little thought this morning I wanted to share with you before I got into my lecture. And it just hit me yesterday that we were talking about the index of forbidden books. And it's interesting that when you look at the situation in the Garden of Eden, we had an index of forbidden fruit for Adam and Eve, and it was based on knowledge. And it just so happens that the index of forbidden books is based on knowledge as well. And the connection just struck me because in the Bible, the knowledge of good and evil is like a special phrase to encapsulate all knowledge, because all knowledge is either good or evil. It's either going to benefit us or be to our detriment. And that's what the devil really does, is he comes to us and says, you can have this knowledge over and above what God has said, what God has declared. And that's basically what our problem is in science today, is that men are tempted to take a bite out of that forbidden fruit of knowledge over and above what God has given us in divine revelation. And of course that gets them into all kinds of trouble. And by this they become gods. I mean, we've all heard that phrase, the gods of science. And anybody who has superior knowledge is generally considered godlike. And so that's what they have done. They exchanged the knowledge that God has given them for their own knowledge, and they have become gods in their own light. And that's exactly what Satan tempted Adam and Eve with. You can become as gods, knowing good and evil. And I just thought that was very interesting. So knowledge can be a very dangerous thing, as they say. Now to St. Augustine. The first thing we need to understand about Augustine is that in many of his concepts, a Platonic or Neoplatonic framework forms the basis of much of his thought. According to most modern philosophers, Plato is the beginning of all philosophy. Among other things, Platonism contains the philosophical concept that the material world we experience on earth has, in the spiritual realms, an ideal image of itself. For lack of a better analogy, it is like the image in a mirror, but an image that does not disappear when the material object it reflects is removed. Picture yourself being bit by a mosquito. There is one thing important to know about this mosquito, however. It is the last mosquito alive on planet Earth. Nevertheless, because of the pain, you decide to smack the mosquito with your hand. Having been flattened like a pancake, the mosquito is virtually unrecognizable. But you need not lose hope that you have eliminated the last mosquito entirely from our existence. Because according to Plato, in the spiritual realm, there is an ideal image of a mosquito preserved for eternity. And thus the universe shall never lose the perfect picture and essence of a mosquito. Hence, in Platonic philosophy, it was the ideal image in the spiritual realm that gave everything of the material world its real meaning and purpose. According to Plato, we know of this ideal world of images because we once existed there. But now we find ourselves on planet Earth living out a somewhat unidealistic life. This is where the philosophical phrase a priori originates. For we, according to Plato, had a prior life in another world. From the knowledge we gained in this prior life, we possess eternal truths which we obtain from the ideal images, truths that will never change, whether they are stated here, on Mars, Alpha Centauri, or wherever, or whether they are stated in the past, in the present, or in the future. How does a 7-year-old know that 2 + 2 not only equals 4, but will always equal 4? How does a grown man know it will always be wrong to take his neighbor's wife? How do Americans know that there will always be death and taxes? Because these are a priori eternal truths that can never change. The search for the origin and nature of eternal truths is behind every philosophy known to man. This has always been the most significant philosophical question. What do we know, and how do we know it? Or, as we find in the world of political intrigue, what did he know and when did he know it? Plato answered the question of the origin of eternal truths by saying, They came from a priori knowledge. Aristotle answered the question a little differently. He held that eternal truths come from the process of abstraction, not a priori knowledge. We see the mosquito on our arm, we smash it, we see a wing here, a proboscis there, and even though it is hardly recognizable as a mosquito, we reason with our ancient intellect, as Aristotle called it, that this mosquito, even if it were to be disintegrated into a speck on our arm, came from a long line of mosquitoes. And that which we see on our arm is only its accidens, its outward form, not the real substance of the mosquito. The real substance of the mosquito, or of being a mosquito, is hidden beneath the accidens, and each material object is composed of both accidens and substance. As we might expect, Aristotle's substance corresponds to Plato's ideal image. But Aristotle's is in the realm of everyday existence on earth, whereas Plato's is in some ethereal spiritual realm. The difference between the two philosophies is precisely why, in the painting by Raphael titled The School of Athens, Plato's hand is pointing vertical, while Aristotle's is pointing horizontal. The contrast between the two schools is also one of the main differences between the overall approaches of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, since after the discovery of the Aristotelian library by the Muslims in the Middle East at the turn of the first millennium, the works of Aristotle only then migrated to Europe, the home of Thomas Aquinas. It is the same reason why almost 1,200 years after the Last Supper, only then did the Catholic Church dogmatically define the nature of the Eucharist at the Fourth Lateran Council, since by this time the philosophy of Aristotle gave us at least some mental concept of what was occurring in the transubstantiation of the Eucharist. And thus the appearance of bread was understood as the accidens, but the presence of Christ understood as the substance, which had miraculously replaced the substance of bread. The truth is that we cannot grasp reality, at least adequately, unless we have a balance between the Platonic universals and the Aristotelian particulars. On the one hand, we cannot look at life as mere ideals without knowing its details and diversity. On the other hand, we cannot get fixated on the details without having universals to keep it all together, so to speak. Where the twain meet, no one has quite been able to figure out. And this is why, after Immanuel Kant, philosophy has more or less resigned itself to accepting that it will never find an answer. And thus we see the rise of pessimistic philosophies such as nihilism, existentialism, and the reason why modern art and architecture is so bizarre. Modern man has given up the hope of finding a unified field of knowledge. Although Augustine was influenced by Platonism, he did not believe in Plato's concept of a prior life, in some ethereal existence before we came to earth. Being a Christian, Augustine believed we were created by God. Nevertheless, he searched Scripture for a truth that corresponded to Plato's a priori truths. Augustine found his answer in John 1 verse 9, which, speaking of Christ, it says, "This was the true light, which, coming into the world, enlightens every man." According to Augustine, it is Christ who gave each man the a priori knowledge, the eternal truths that Plato had ascribed to the a priori life. 1,300 years later, Immanuel Kant tried to say the same thing. He held that man's knowledge of eternal truths were a product of what he called the, quote, categories of the mind, unquote. But the insurmountable obstacle that Kant faced was that he had no way of proving that what we knew in our mind corresponded to the reality of the thing in itself that we saw outside of our mind. As a result, our mental knowledge could not be called absolute knowledge, and thus eternal truths were limited to our mind. It was all in our head, so to speak. Neither Kant nor Plato believed in an intimate and personal God who could give such a priori knowledge. And this is the basic difference between the Greeks, modern philosophy, and Christianity. That is, divine revelation and miraculous creation. But being somewhat of a Platonist in his approach to life, Augustine had a tendency, or perhaps a penchant, to assign allegorical or idealistic interpretations to the historical narratives of Scripture, especially when he thought the narrative was too hard to interpret on the mundane and literal level. Sometimes, to answer the difficulty, Augustine would create a hybrid of literal and allegorical interpretation. Often he would insist that the hybrid was also a literal interpretation, but a different literalness than we are accustomed to. For example, since in Genesis 1, Augustine saw no mention of the creation of the angels, he adopted an interpretation of Genesis 1, verse 3, which asserted that the light in the clause, "let there be light," referred to the creation of the angels rather than to light we know as consisting of photons. This self-imposed quest to find room for the angels would inevitably affect both Augustine's interpretation of the rest of Genesis 1 and set a precedent for biblical interpretation with which exegetes from then to now have not ceased to struggle. Because of such Augustinian interpretations, many faithful exegetes are torn between their deep admiration for Augustine, since he was probably the greatest exegete and thinker of the first millennium, and the fact that all the other fathers who addressed Genesis 1, who were likewise great thinkers and faithful devotees to the church, understood the light of Genesis 1, verse 3 as plain, ordinary light, and felt no compulsion to find a specific place for the angels, having assumed they were already included in the opening verse of Genesis 1, verse 1, "In the beginning God made the heavens and the earth." Moreover, since the focus of Genesis 1 is not on angels but on man, the fathers were not bothered by the apparent lacuna. In light of this, Augustine does not claim that he has found the final answer to the problems of exegeting Genesis 1. Far from it. He writes, quote, "This is my explanation, unless someone can propose an interpretation that is clearer and more in keeping with the text," unquote. In the same book, he writes, quote, "We should not rush in headlong and so firmly take our stand on one side that, if further progress in the search of truth justly undermines this position, we too fall with it. That would be to battle not for the teaching of Holy Scripture, but for our own, wishing its teaching to conform to ours, whereas we ought to wish ours to conform to that of the sacred Scripture," unquote. And he states that God purposely inspired Scripture to be difficult in some places, stating that we are left with, quote, "interpreting words that have been written obscurely for the purpose of stimulating our thought," unquote. And in light of that, he adds, quote, "I have not rashly taken my stand on one side against a rival interpretation which might possibly be better," unquote. Nevertheless, having this unyielding focus on the angels leads Augustine to suggest that perhaps the 6 days of Genesis 1 are not consecutive 24-hour days, but one day, whereas all the fathers previous to Augustine held that Genesis 1 was composed of 6 24-hour days, the only exception being Origen, who had an extreme penchant for allegorizing, which he learned from the Greek philosopher Philo. Augustine further stipulated that the one day of creation was not in reference to time, but to causality, that is, an instantaneous creation of everything in heaven and earth. But Augustine believes 6 is a special number. And here we see him shifting to his allegorical interpretation. He proposes that the Genesis writer use 6 days so as to have the angels contemplate the creation in 6 frames or concepts. This certainly is a unique interpretation, since not only do the other fathers not even remotely suggest such an interpretation, but hardly any of the medievals adopted it either, although some, like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas, paid their respects to it, if not for anything else than the utmost admiration they had for Augustine and his interpretive abilities. Personally, however, Thomas believed the light of Genesis 1:3 was plain, ordinary household light. The Rationes Seminales. Now we come close to the issue at hand. As any good Catholic realizes, anyone who puts forth ideas in regards to the interpretation of Scripture must at the very least have consulted the Fathers. And unless there is some overwhelming evidence contrary to their consensual teaching, one is required to find precedent in the Fathers for any specific interpretation, especially